A lone bugle call pierced the sultry air of Guadalcanal on a September afternoon in 1942. Its echo carried across the water and drifted into the surrounding jungle where Marines were pinned down, desperate for rescue. Among the many stories of bravery that emerged during the brutal Pacific Campaign of World War II, none would shine quite so brightly or end quite so tragically as that of Douglas Albert Munro. Standing on the deck of a small, heavily overloaded landing craft, Munro pressed his lips together, swallowed his fear, and signaled the boats behind him to move in. Smoke rose in the distance, and the staccato rattle of machine gun fire cut the thick, humid air. It was a sight that would have made most men recoil. Yet Munro stood there steadfastly, determined to do whatever it took to save the men still on the beach. It was in that moment that he would demonstrate the depth of his courage and compassion, even at the ultimate cost. A moment rarely examined in full depth, but one that continues to echo powerfully through history. In order to understand how a young man in his early 20s found himself commanding a perilous rescue operation in one of the most unforgiving theaters of war, we must first glimpse the world he came from. Douglas Munro was born on October 11, 1919, in Vancouver, British Columbia, to an American father and a British mother. The aftermath of World War I weighed heavily on families all over the globe, influencing children's upbringings in ways both subtle and profound. As nations struggled to rebuild, veterans told stories of trenches and fallen comrades, reminding the next generation of the brutality of warfare. Munro's father, James, had served briefly in various capacities, and though he rarely spoke of the hardships he'd witnessed, that silent stoicism imprinted itself on Douglas from an early age. The family soon moved to Washington State, seeking better work prospects and a fresh start in the post-war environment. Douglas grew up in South Cle, Elam, surrounded by towering evergreen trees and forging friendships with the children of miners, farmers, and railway workers. They were tight-knit communities reliant on shared effort and mutual trust, a perfect breeding ground for a young man with a strong sense of responsibility toward others. Those who knew Douglas as a child described him as inquisitive, warm-hearted, and uncommonly empathetic for a boy of his age. Even in grammar school, teachers noted how he would console classmates who were upset and volunteer to carry books for ailing or frail students. He was not a saint. He had mischief in him, as most boys do. But there was an undercurrent of genuine concern for people around him. By the time he reached high school, the looming specter of another global conflict had begun to grow. Japan's expansion in East Asia and Europe's fragmentation under the looming threat of Nazi aggression were daily headlines, fueling conversations around the dinner table and in the local cafes. Douglas, like many young men of his generation, felt the rumble of conflict before war was officially declared. Although he could have chosen a quiet life working on the railroads or in forestry, a safer path that would have kept him close to home, Munro found himself drawn to serve a greater cause. Some chalked it up to youthful idealism. Others believed it was simply the next logical step for a compassionate soul called to stand guard over those in need. When Douglas enlisted in the United States Coast Guard in 1939, the move baffled a few of his friends, who expected him to choose the Navy or the Marines. But for Munro, the Coast Guard's rescue missions and humanitarian focus resonated strongly with his own ideals. He trained at the Coast Guard station in Port Angeles, Washington, and later in New York, mastering seamanship, small craft handling, and gunnery. Many recruits joked that the Coast Guard was the forgotten service, overshadowed by the Army, Navy, and Marines. Munro, however, took immense pride in the branch's dual role, protecting American shores in peacetime and acting as a vital partner in naval operations during war. Even as a trainee, he had a way of rallying the spirits of those around him. One memoir from a fellow Coast Guardsman recalled how Douglas never let anyone linger in self-doubt. If a recruit struggled with knots or navigation, he was the first to offer patient assistance. The man wrote, "I watched him time and again share the weight on a comrade's shoulders. When you see that quality in someone, you know he's destined to lead." That sense of destiny began to crystallize when America officially entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Almost overnight, life changed for every service member. The Coast Guard was rapidly integrated into the Navy's efforts, and Munro's expertise with small boats made him an ideal candidate for missions requiring precise navigation under fire, especially in the new priority theater, the Pacific. By mid-1942, he was transferred to a forward operating area in the Solomon Islands. The humid jungles, mosquito-infested coastlines, and fierce Japanese resistance in places like Tulagi and Guadalcanal quickly made the Solomons campaign one of the war's most grueling. It was there that Douglas met Ray Evans, who would become not just a fellow Coast Guardsman, but also his closest friend and confidant. Letters and diary entries suggest they formed a bond rooted in mutual trust, having each other's backs under the direst circumstances. Together they were assigned to small vessel operations, transporting Marines for landings and evacuations amidst near constant threat from enemy aircraft, artillery, and snipers, hiding in thick foliage along the shoreline. Despite the relentless tension, it was not all darkness. Whenever they had downtime, brief though it was, Douglas and Ray would read letters from home, share jokes, and try to replicate the smallest pleasures of civilian life, whether that meant a quick cup of coffee in the makeshift galley or a friendly game of cards on a battered crate. Yet behind these small moments of levity loomed the knowledge that the next mission could easily be their last. The pressure of being responsible for the lives of the Marines aboard their boats took a personal toll. Douglas rarely slept more than a few hours at a stretch. In a journal entry that survived the war, he confessed, "It's hard to keep my eyes closed, thinking about men on shore who might be hurt or pinned down. Maybe we'll be their only chance out." On September 27th, 1942, that haunting premonition turned into a stark reality that would define Munro's legacy. A contingent of about 500 Marines under Major Kenneth Bailey had advanced to Point Cruz, confronting formidable Japanese defenses near the Matanikau River. As the fighting grew ferocious, the Marines found themselves at risk of encirclement. Urgent radio calls went out for naval support to evacuate them. The problem was that the landing craft needed to approach a shoreline strewn with coral reefs and battered by enemy fire from hidden positions. Coastal waters were often shallow, making large Navy vessels vulnerable to ground fire, so the job fell to smaller craft manned by men who could navigate precarious surf under duress. Munro volunteered, leading a group of 10 landing craft. He meticulously planned the approach, deciding which boat would lead, how they would form a protective screen, and where they might position machine guns to suppress enemy fire. This was the product of his Coast Guard training and his intuitive sense that saving lives often required orchestrating chaos with calm determination. Under withering gunfire, Munro positioned his boat in front of the other landing craft, using its hull and whatever meager shielding they could muster to draw Japanese attention away from the vulnerable Marines. One eyewitness, Marine Private Robert F. Smith, later recounted, "I saw this boat with the Coast Guard insignia weaving across our front, spitting gunfire at anything moving in the brush on shore, as if daring the enemy to shoot back at them. not at us. That dare cost Munro dearly. Bullets tore through the fiberglass hull, and shrapnel from mortar rounds began raining down. Yet he refused to pull back until every last Marine was either aboard or had made it to a safer vantage point. There were moments of intense confusion. Some Marines, disoriented, ran the wrong way or froze in terror. Munro yelled through a bullhorn, gesturing to help them find the right boat. Against all odds, nearly 500 men were rescued from what had been a rapidly deteriorating situation. In the final phase of the evacuation, a Japanese machine gun emplacement opened fire from a concealed position. A spray of bullets struck Munro, wounding him fatally. According to Ray Evans, who was by his side, Douglas's last words were a question. Did they get off? The answer was yes. Hundreds of Marines made it out that day, and many of them would never forget the price Munro paid to ensure their survival. The official Coast Guard after-action report described his conduct as exemplary and beyond the call of duty. In recognition of his heroism, Munro was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the only Coast Guardsman in American history to receive this distinction. The tragedy of losing such a bright, compassionate young man at just 22 years of age reverberated well beyond the battlefield. His parents received the telegram while finishing supper one evening in South Clay, Elam. Friends of the family recalled that his mother, Edith, stood silently with tears in her eyes for what felt like an eternity before collapsing into her husband's arms. Letters of condolence flooded in, including one from a Marine who credited Munro with saving his entire squad. "I only saw him for a moment," the letter read, "but that moment changed the entire course of my life. I have a family now, and I owe that to the man who didn't hesitate to risk everything for us." Douglas's friends wrestled with heartbreak, and Ray Evans would carry the memory of his sacrifice with him for the rest of his life, often recounting it in interviews and speeches to illustrate the profound impact one individual could have on so many others in war. Beyond his valor in uniform, Douglas Munro's personal life was marked by deep attachments that make his sacrifice all the more poignant. While stationed at various bases before deploying, he wrote frequent letters home, including ones to a high school sweetheart. The content of these letters was tender and hopeful. In one particularly moving note, he spoke about dreaming of peace, a home, and a time when no one has to worry about bombs or bullets. Though no formal engagement was ever announced, family friends believed marriage was simply a matter of timing, a plan to be realized once the world regained its sanity. He also corresponded often with his mother, whom he addressed in affectionate terms, openly sharing his fears and concerns. Surviving fragments of her replies reveal a mother's desperate hope for her son's safe return. "Stay steadfast," she wrote. "Your heart will guide you in what's right." The personal toll of his death was devastating for the entire community. Edith later recalled how haunted she felt, wondering if she had encouraged him too strongly to follow his conscience. The burden of that question lingered even as she publicly celebrated her son as a hero. During the war, and in its aftermath, there was little time or space for a nuanced discussion of ethical complexities. In the decades since, however, historians and commentators have delved into possible controversies surrounding Munro's story. One recurring debate focuses on the broader context of the Solomons campaign and the tremendous casualties suffered there. Some argue that the amphibious assaults by American forces were too hastily planned, resulting in unnecessary loss of life, and that the lines of communication between Army, Navy, and Marines were frequently tangled, endangering service members like Munro. Others point out that the chaotic, intense nature of the Pacific Campaign left few alternatives. Given the grim strategic reality, each mission was a gamble. Munro's heroic intervention underscores both the extraordinary bravery required and the extreme risk inherent in these operations. In this vein, some historians propose that the conflict might have been shortened with a different allocation of resources or better coordination with Allied forces, potentially reducing the number of dangerous small boat missions. Yet supporters counter that such viewpoints benefit from hindsight and that the fierce Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal gave Allied forces little choice but to mount risky landings and rescues at critical junctures. For many, Munro's sacrifice is emblematic of the moral complexity of war itself, the tension between necessary action and the tragic costs paid by individuals thrust into the maelstrom. A secondary debate sometimes arises regarding the depiction of Coast Guardsmen in official histories. Early accounts of the Guadalcanal campaign often focused on the roles of the Marines and Navy, relegating the Coast Guard to footnotes. Some critics maintain that Munro's singular act of valor became a convenient symbol used to represent the Coast Guard's entire contribution to the war, possibly overshadowing the broader involvement of countless other Coast Guardsmen who undertook similarly dangerous missions. Yet those who served alongside Munro insist that, while he was not alone in his heroism, he was by all measures an exceptional figure whose story rightly stands out for its emotional resonance. Indeed, numerous Marine veterans singled him out in their memoirs, crediting him personally for saving their lives. The result is a multifaceted legacy that invites ongoing conversation about how best to honor individual bravery while also recognizing collective sacrifice. Douglas Munro's life carries enduring historical weight for reasons both tangible and deeply symbolic. Strategically, the rescue at Point Cruz allowed the Marines to regroup, rearm, and continue the grueling battle for Guadalcanal. That island would ultimately become the linchpin for the Allied offensive across the Pacific, marking the first major offensive victory against Japan. Had the Marines been lost on that shore, the morale, momentum, and tactical positioning in the region might have taken a dire turn. From a military standpoint, Munro's leadership under fire provided an early, vivid demonstration of how crucial small boats and amphibious rescues could be in modern warfare. In a broader sense, it highlighted the often overlooked versatility of the Coast Guard, proving that it could adapt to combat situations traditionally perceived as the domain of the Navy or Marines. Consequently, doctrines evolved, and the Coast Guard's role as both a life-saving and combat-ready service gained recognition. Through his short life, Douglas Munro invites us to contemplate the often uneasy balance between duty and self-preservation, between patriotism and personal sacrifice. His actions remind us that the heroic ideal isn't a distant myth, but a very real possibility that arises when ordinary individuals are moved by extraordinary commitment to their fellow human beings. That's all for today's video. Don't forget to leave a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe so you'll always be in the loop. Thanks for watching.